We're talking mostly about McDonald's.
Welcome everyone to the July 19th meeting of the Planning and Zoning Commission for the City of Asheville. Planning and Zoning Commission will hear public comment on items which are listed on the agenda. There are also other ways to provide public comment, either by phone, voicemail, or by email. That information is listed if you wish for future meetings on the agenda sheet, which is at the front of the room you came in. We will start this evening's meeting with roll call. Mr. Palmquist.
Chair Archibald.
Present.
Vice Chair Levi.
Present.
Commissioner Fairclough.
Present.
Commissioner Hope.
Present.
Commissioner Barton.
Present.
And Commissioner Bubenik.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. First item on the agenda is approval of the minutes from June 7th and also from June 21st of this year. Miss Ashley, we can do these both at once, or do we need to do them individually? Remind me.
You can do them both.
Okay, all right. Any comments, questions, revisions on those?
I would like to note that we didn't have a July 7th meeting, so, and I'm referring to the June 7th meeting minutes. For level 268 Carter Street, the motion was made to continue to July 7th, 2023 meeting, and we did not have that, so it needs to be rescheduled.
So that's a correction to the June 7th meeting?
It's a correction to the June 7th meeting minutes. We did vote for July 7th, but that meeting didn't actually happen.
I mean, technically it's correct what we did. We just never had that meeting, and then that item didn't get moved to this meeting. Yeah, it's more of a note that it's still floating, I guess, technically.
We'll renotice for that item when it gets scheduled.
Yeah.
again, So,
Yeah, there was some, so we did end up not having the July 7th. Technically, this is the July meeting, even though it's in that mid-month time slot. We just have moved things around with the way project schedules and obviously summer.
I believe that's also for Grandview Place.
correct.
Okay.
Correct, yep.
We are renoticing for that one as well.
Okay.
So it'll be properly noticed through the mailings and the sign postings for August 2nd.
Okay, great. With those two minor notes, I'll make a motion to approve the minutes from both June 7th and June 21st. Do I have a second?
Second.
Have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously.
These, final decisions that have been made, and understand that you all have not had a lot of time to really review them. But regardless of the outcome of this evening, hoping that this could be a really productive discussion between you all and the project team to talk through the merits of the project and to ask any questions and get clarification on items. This presentation will be a little bit lengthier, given that I want to make sure everyone's on the same page with the information being presented, understanding of the requirements of the UDO zoning code, and do the kind of the scale and impact of the project, spend enough time to go through it. That being said, we'll probably start with some prettier pictures that the applicant provided, and then some boring text that I'm providing. So without further ado, the conditional zoning petition for Project Aspire consists of these three properties that are bounded by Woodfin and Oak Street, College Street, Charlotte Street on the east, Central Ave to the west, and then the I-240 East exit ramp. It's kind of located in the northern section of downtown, slightly removed from the core of the downtown, but still located within the CBD zoning district. You can see the existing conditions here a little bit more. So again, it's this entire area that consists of the current YMCA, the First Baptist Church of Asheville, and the State Employee Credit Union Bank, and all the surface parking in between is the project site, which is 10.5 acres in total. As you can see here, the existing zoning is central business districts, and due to the size of the project, a rezoning to the central business district expansion district conditional zone is required. The future land use, as designated in the City of Asheville's Living Asheville Comprehensive Plan, is downtown, and no change in that designation would be required. Let's see. Other aspects of the zoning include that the site is located in the Downtown Design Review Overlay. It is outside of the traditional downtown core. Both Woodfin and Oak, College, and Charlotte are all designated key pedestrian streets in the CBD district in the UDO, and the First Baptist Church is identified in the UDO as an existing visual landmark. So, some background on the project, kind of the high elevation, large-scale view of the project is that in total, approximately 1.1 million square feet of construction is proposed. And at this point, given the conceptual master plan nature of the project that I'll speak to in a little more detail momentarily, there are proposed ranges of those uses that would be the minimums and maximums being proposed on this site. So for residential, it'd be a minimum of 400 and a maximum of 650 residential units. The community recreational use, which would mainly consist of a new YMCA space, is between 60 and 75,000 square feet. Office uses between 133,000 and 250,000 square feet. Commercial uses between 75 and 120,000 square feet, and a hotel use between 165 and 300 guest rooms. Supporting all that is parking located mainly in two different parking garages with between 1,600 and 2,000 parking spaces. So a little more detail about the scale and size of these buildings. You can see them labeled here, building 1 through 5. Building 1 being proposed is a 6-story building that would have the new YMCA building, retail and commercial use, as well as potentially residential uses. Building 2 is the proposed hotel use on College Street, mainly on College Street, and also on Oak and Woodfin and Charlotte Streets. That's proposed at about 20 stories in height. Building 3, which is shown as two buildings, it's labeled as 1, kind of shown as 2. It could be any kind of combination of those, but for all intents and purposes is a single building as far as use and scale goes in these plans is a 6-story tall building with office and commercial uses. Building 4 along mainly Central Avenue is a 19-story tall proposed residential building with commercial. And then building 5, kind of in the background of the site, is 6 stories tall with residential and commercial. So that's kind of the overall programming of the site. You can see the different colors corresponding to those uses, with the orange being the residential, the red being the ground floor, commercial uses, blue for office, green for YMCA, and then purple for the bluish purple for the hotel. The project is proposed to be constructed in phases. So essentially, phase 1 would consist of the demolition of the bank building at the Oak Street address, and that would allow for the construction of the hotel building and the mixed-use YMCA building. As soon as that YMCA building is open and operational, the existing YMCA building can be demolished, at which time the phase 2 construction would presumably begin. So that's kind of the hinge point in the overall concept of the project is that new YMCA being constructed and occupied so that the existing one can be demolished for the second phase to begin. So this slide kind of breaks down that phasing in a little more detail. So again, phase 1 is located on the southern portion of the site where the existing bank building is. It will consist of possibly between 100 and 200 residential units and 75,000 and 120,000 commercial square feet of commercial. And I'll say possibly, since the applicant has indicated that that has some flexibility built into it, where they're suggesting that that phase could either have that residential use with that minimum ground floor commercial, or could potentially not have residential and have more commercial use instead. Again, that building would have the YMCA function between 60 and 75,000 square feet, and the parking to serve that, and the proposed hotel further south that has between 165 and 300 guest rooms. Phase 2, located on the western part of the site, would have the majority of the residential uses, between 300 and 450 units, office between 125 and 218,000 square feet, commercial between 30,000 and 88,000 square feet, and then parking between 900 and 1,100 spaces, mainly located in this proposed structured parking deck that is wrapped by building number 5. So as hinted at and talked about a little bit informally beforehand, is this proposed review process for this conditional zoning is something that's a little bit unique in regards to the projects that are typically reviewed by you all and end up going before City Council for a conditional zoning approval. We are basically reviewing this as a conceptual master plan that would follow the typical conditional zoning process for projects in the CBD as currently laid out. However, specific details about design, heights, specific number of uses and units, as you saw, would be in ranges rather than specific numbers. The idea of which being this would allow some flexibility so that following the presumed adoption of this conditional zoning, the project could return in phases and be reviewed in more detail at a later date through the final TRC review process. And each of those phases would not necessarily have to return to City Council for an amendment to the conditional zoning, as long as the plans met the overall parameters established in this conceptual master plan entitlement process. It would require a review and approval by the Design Review Committee, as well as a ministerial site plan review and approval by the Planning and Zoning Commission. And the DRC review, as proposed and kind of requested by the applicant and detailed in the project conditions, would be limited to the design and appearance of the proposed buildings and would not materially affect the entitlement conveyed through the conditional zoning process. So now I'll kind of get a little more in the nuts and bolts of the zoning, just mainly based around the CBD form code district, with some overlay for the hotel overlay district that modifies some of this zoning. But essentially, in the CBD, there are really no density or structure size, impervious surface, lot size, or width requirements. There are minimum and maximum setbacks in the front of 0 feet, except where buildings meet the sidewalks and create an urban streetscape. The project is requesting a modification for that front yard setback, but their intent really is to have buildings front on the sidewalk and be connected to those streetscape amenities. Regarding a step back of buildings, so what is required is a minimum 10-foot deep step back at the street wall height along at least 2/3 of the building's facade. So basically what that means is that at a certain height at the front of the building, you have to kind of step the building back at least 10 feet so that there's some relief at the ground floor visually. This requirement applies to rights-of-ways less than 75 feet wide, so would actually only apply to building number 4, the large residential building on Central Avenue. The project is seeking a modification for that requirement to provide a 5-foot wide step back instead of the required 10-foot wide step back. Other requirements are for buildings that are explicitly taller than 75 feet in height, in that a side step back that equals half of the width of the facade is required. And the project is seeking a modification for that zoning requirement. Furthermore, for floors above 75 feet in height, the maximum Horizontal wall dimension in any direction is limited to 145 feet. The project is seeking a modification for that maximum horizontal wall dimension for floors above 75 feet in height, but not to exceed the following. So those are enumerated and range between 240 feet to 280 feet in length. So that's about 100 feet over the maximum currently allowed by right in the CBD district. Regarding landscaping, the requirements are relatively minimal in the CBD as it is an urban character. Street trees are required at a rate of 1 large tree per every 40 linear feet of property. Street buffers are required for vehicle use areas in parking lots that are within 50 feet of the edge of the street and over 4,000 square feet in size. Tree canopy preservation requirements are required still. The site is located in the downtown resource area and the project is Class A. Those requirements could be met in the future phases of the project through a combination of existing tree preservation, new tree plantings, or payment in fee of lieu. So regarding the transportation elements of the project, this is something that staff and the project team have worked really closely on in conjunction with staff from the transportation department as well to try to maximize the ability of the project to enhance the bike and pedestrian networks around the area. There are existing sidewalks around the site. They are somewhat minimal as existing today. Some are certainly not as wide as the required 10-foot wide minimum for new projects. So this project would seek to enhance that streetscape and the sidewalk widths around the project site. So I'll start with kind of talking about the sidewalk elements and then move on to the bike facilities. So Charlotte Street, that fronts the project on the east, is proposed to have an 11-foot wide sidewalk with tree grates integrated into the sidewalk. College Street, which is along the southern portion of the site for a relatively short distance of the project, is proposed at 14 feet wide with tree grates, as well as an 8-foot wide bus stop area. Oak and Woodfin Street, which is probably the longest length of frontage along the project, is proposed in a way that continues the existing character of that street, which has a relatively wide, around about 7 feet wide planting strip. So this project would maintain that character, which is found elsewhere on the street and on the other side of the street, and have a wider sidewalk than today with a 15-foot wide sidewalk provided. Central Avenue, which has a large residential building fronting it, would provide a 20-foot wide sidewalk with tree grates, and effectively that would help to push some of that massing of that larger building further away from the street as well. I'll note that the sidewalks and proposed bike facilities would be mostly located in the right-of-way. In the event that some of the sidewalks are on private property, the applicant is proposing that buildings would extend perhaps over the sidewalk where it is on private property, but above a minimal clear zone as specified in building codes. And they may also have basements below up to the property line, but that is a way to kind of maximize the buildable area of the site while also providing these wider amenities as well. To note that sidewalks internal to the project, not within the public right-of-way, will be a minimum of 10 feet in width as well. There are also off-street bike facilities, commonly known as cycle tracks, proposed. Essentially, these are elements that are protected by a curb or other barriers. They're integrated into the sidewalk and streetscape. They're not on-street facilities, so they're more substantial than simply adding a painted lane to the street. These would likely sit between the street and the sidewalk. Essentially, these are at a minimum width of 5 feet with a 6-foot wide typical width, and they would exist along Charlotte and College Streets. So it would help to bridge some of those gaps that exist currently where we have bike lanes north of I-240 on Charlotte Street and also west of the project site past that roundabout on College Street where bike lanes begin again. So this would propose to kind of fill in that missing L-shaped gap in that network as you enter the city's downtown. Both Charlotte and College Streets are served by bus transit. There's a bus stop on College Street near the corner of Oak Street with a very minimal bus shelter, as well as a bus stop on Charlotte Street near the corner of I-240's east off-ramp that has no shelter. The project proposes to improve both of these transit stops to bus shelters to be designed based on the standard city specifications. And then some of these items delve more into the project conditions that have been agreed to by the applicant. But a lot of that kind of fleshes out some of the detail that the project is proposing. One of which is a standard condition regarding the traffic impact analysis that's required to be conducted for a project of this scale and done through the NCDOT process, where the project shall implement those recommendations identified. So those are things like if they need to retime a traffic signal or add a traffic signal or a turn lane, fairly typical, mostly vehicular-based approaches to traffic. However, the applicants agreed to some additional conditions that would help to address items regarding pedestrian, delivery, TDM approaches to parking. The first one being trying to mitigate the potential for impacts with the various curb cuts being proposed for the entire master plan to make sure that there are no significant backups or degradation of intersections that would negatively impact the surrounding area or the project itself. The consideration of a freight and service delivery access to minimize impacts to adjacent roadways, so a way for delivery to happen in a way that is the most efficient and least impactful to the surrounding roadways and not cause any backing up along any of the streets. The consideration of a transportation demand management and parking management plan to discourage single occupancy vehicle usage, and a further evaluation of improvements to the pedestrian connectivity network, including the considerations of new crosswalks as necessary. As the design gets further evolved and the buildings move forward into the next phase of review, better understanding of where entrances are, where pedestrian desire lines would be, is going to be really critical to the success of the project. Many folks will be crossing Oak and Woodfin Street to get into the downtown core and trying to design those pedestrian connections in a way that facilitates a safe crossing of that roadway would be an important consideration of that. And some of the final conditions, these are more related to things that the project is providing and kind of, proffering for lack of a better word, one of which is a minimum of 20% of the residential units in both phases to be designated affordable to those earning at or below 80% AMI. Also to note that for phase 2, 20% of these affordable units would accept housing choice vouchers, or they will fall into the federal low-income housing tax credit program. As noted on the project's master plan conceptual drawings, approximately, there are ground floor commercial and retail uses proposed, and these would be a minimum of 75% for the majority of the buildings. It's further detailed in the actual project conditions document that about 50% would apply to the hotel building on the public street-facing ground floor facades for each of those buildings, and that vehicle access and service areas are excluded from that total. That is, for the most part, above and beyond what's required in the CBD code for non-hotel buildings. It's something that the project team has been proposing, and this is a way to kind of codify those suggestions and understanding that kind of activation and activity at the ground floor of these buildings is a huge value to the city and the residents. So that's what that is trying to address. Furthermore, the project will preserve the trees that are identified for preservation on the master plan site plan drawings. If they're deemed healthy by the city arborists, and they will be protected per the zoning's requirements for tree protection in construction projects. The project team has noted that if any of those trees are damaged or lost as a result of the construction activities, They will be replaced with a similar or the same species in the same place or other location within the project area as determined by the city arborist. The project will also meet the stormwater requirements found in the UDO section 712.2, and those requirements are going to be based, as they typically are, on the pre-development runoff coefficient. That would be based on the current conditions of the site at the time of the adoption of the conditional zoning. The project will use best efforts to utilize green stormwater infrastructure devices, and thus could include items such as rain gardens, green roofs, bioswales, to manage the stormwater quality before it ends up in the stormwater system. So finally, we'll talk a little bit about the technical modifications that are being requested through the conditional zoning process. These were discussed a little bit earlier, but just to reiterate, these are the modifications for the CBD form code, so the underlying zoning code. They include modifications to the front yard setback for buildings, the required 10-foot wide step back for the building on Central Avenue, but with a minimum 5-foot wide step back. The floor plates, that would be in excess of the maximum 40% of the lot area. So essentially take the entire site and above 75 feet in height. Basically 40% of the site can't be buildings above 75 feet in height. I think some of that calculation is still TBD from the applicant team, but that is a modification being requested in case they exceed that. As noted earlier, the maximum horizontal wall dimensions for portions of the building above 75 feet in height, which is typically 145 feet, a linear distance, but not to exceed the following: between 240 and 280 feet based on the building's design. And then finally, that there would be no required side step back for the facade of buildings above 75 feet, which is typically required to be half of the facade width above 75 feet. And then there are a couple technical modifications for the hotel overlay. So this would modify the existing zoning for the hotel use that's proposed at the corner of College and Charlotte Street. Essentially, and this language could be modified to be a little more clear, but essentially what's being shown is the required code, and then the underlined portion is talking about the part that's being modified. So typically for hotels that are wider than 50 feet in the CBD, half of the street-facing facade is required to be set aside as a separate occupiable storefront between at least 15 feet deep on an average of 20 feet deep with a separate public entrance. So these are separate uses like a separate store or restaurant that's not connected to the hotel and has a different activity of its own that's generated besides the coming and goings of guests to hotels and whatnot. And that number can be aggregated across multiple facades. What the request to modify this would be that the requirement could be satisfied by commercial uses associated with the hotel, like lobbies and reception areas, and active facade design that addresses the public realm, vehicle access, and other items too, would be excluded from that facade length calculation. The other requirement that's being sought to be modified is when there are parking garages fronting on and located within 50 feet of primary and secondary streets in the CBD district, where a full 20-foot deep habitable story is required. Does not necessarily have to be a separate space, but has to be a building depth of 20 feet. And this would likely apply to the Building 1, the YMCA commercial and potentially residential building that wraps the proposed parking deck that serves the hotel use. And this condition would be changed to note that the exception would apply to Charlotte Street, which may have an active facade design in lieu of what's being called the liner or the ground floor use, which is really a function of the limited depths of the parking structure behind it. Also notes that the project hotel does not use the full area of the hotel overlay district and that the guidelines above apply to the hotel use only, That might be cleaned up at some point, but that kind of helps explain the impetus for those two technical modifications. And moving on to the project's adherence and relative consistency with Living Asheville's comprehensive plan. Overall, the project is consistent with the future land use designation of downtown, which talks a lot about a lot of different things, but really the idea being that new development revitalizes the edges of downtown and connects to the core with infill development, which this project is seeking to do. Also that, residential areas benefit by having full-time residents, that the downtown population growing is a benefit to the city and to the downtown. Downtown is sustainable and resilient, a place to work, relax, and visit among a vibrant and engaging urban environment. That the downtown is a hub of the city's transit system, supports this. Pedestrian and bicycle facilities should be a priority, and then enhancement of those areas, as well as green infrastructure, such as stormwater, tree canopy, and public spaces, should be prioritized and supported by sound urban design and placemaking principles. The project also supports a number of goals in the plan, such as to encourage responsible growth by providing infill development in targeted growth areas, to increase and diversify the housing supply by increasing the supply of housing, including affordable housing in proximity to schools, transit, and parks, and to increase access to safe bicycling by expanding bicycle facilities and removing gaps in the city's bicycle network. So the project's been through already a somewhat intense review process. It was reviewed by the city's internal staff-led technical review committee for technical compliance back in March, where it was approved with conditions. It was informally reviewed at the March 23rd design review committee. A lot of elements talked about items that we're discussing tonight, such as the ability to create a high-quality public realm, looking at the reduction of interior street widths, improving the gateway to downtown via Charlotte Street with this project, inviting people into the site and through it instead of just around it, celebrating the eclectic nature of the First Baptist Church and incorporating that into the design of the new buildings, and some massing considerations that the project has responded to, such as flipping the step back on the upper stories of the tallest buildings. The project was also informally reviewed by the Multimodal Transportation Commission on April 26th, where different opportunities to enhance the multimodal connections through the area of downtown were discussed, including elements such as sidewalks, bike facilities, and enhanced transit service. The project was informally reviewed at the Downtown Commission meeting on May 12th, where elements discussed the opportunity for affordable housing, commitment to green building and innovative stormwater management techniques, the preservation of the large mature trees along the street and internal to the site where possible, designing internal streets that felt more like public streets and private streets, and ensuring that new building design relates to historic buildings in the area. And that's kind of a summation of those main discussions. The project was reviewed and approved with conditions at the May 18th Design Review Committee. I did want to have those conditions available to relate to you all. They varied between design-oriented, site-oriented, and other aspects of the project. So thinking about the different architectural precedents in the area of this area of downtown, and that the project could include a broad range of architectural styles and responses. Thinking about how the project could exceed the minimum UDO requirements for sidewalk widths, such as is being proposed currently. That the project should prioritize green stormwater infrastructure, which the project states that they would like to do and look for opportunities to do so. That the project protect as many trees as possible, and that future plantings exceed the size and number as required in the UDO. That the project considers the building's pedestrian scale, articulation, and engagement along Central Ave, College Street, and Charlotte Street. I know something that the project has worked closely on to provide that type of ground floor activation, and where they perhaps are not able to provide alternative measures that would achieve similar objectives to that. That the applicant develop a relationship with the East End Valley neighborhood and other neighborhoods as appropriate to mitigate construction impacts and help build community capacity. And some discussion about in the event that the property line in the existing intersection at Charlotte and College Streets is modified, and that is where we have kind of that ramp right turn as you're heading down Charlotte Street and turning right onto College Street. If that ever were to be modified or removed or turned into just a regular intersection, that the project does have the ability or the blessing, so to speak, of the DRC to better activate and engage with that corner, whether it's with building or landscape or streetscape or any kind of programming to help tie in that corner better to the building than it is today due to the presence of that intersection. That the project's request for the modification to the street wall step back, as we talked about earlier, be granted with the use of articulation and street wall activation on a per building basis. So they're understanding that that street wall step back modification was being sought, that the building should still activate with the street and also articulate and be refined so as not to be a monolithic type design is the intent behind that condition. And finally, that the project utilize their property to enhance the public realm with elements such as water, sidewalks, and bike lanes as applicable with the conceptual master plan, which the project team has noted that for elements like the sidewalks and bike lanes, they would be located on property if there is not sufficient right-of-way width to do so. So as mentioned earlier, staff is generally supportive of the project, but recommends a continuance at this time in order to work with the applicant team to address any outstanding concerns, some of which have been better addressed, like the streetscape, some of which still remain, such as the building massing, the technical modifications being requested, and the project conditions document. And as also mentioned earlier, just given the timing of the project and the time of review that you've had with this information, recommending continuance seems like the fair option, given the scope and scale of this proposed project. And that concludes my presentation. I'm glad to answer any questions. The applicant, like I mentioned, is also here with us this evening and is able to provide more information than I might be able to as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Palmquist. That was definitely a thorough and detailed review of the project. Any comments or immediate questions, I guess, from the commission at this time?
Yes, thank you. And I know there's been a lot of work hours from you and the planning team on this, so thank you for that. I got 3 quick comments. The first one is, I've mentioned this before, I know the fee in lieu for tree plantings, I know it's not right now, but in the future when that does come up, we use that option.